Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me here tonight. I'm going to be talking about the supernatural folklore of the American Appalachian region and how it can offer a window into the tapestry of Appalachian culture, reflecting this convergence of diverse influences and cultural themes. These are rooted in the amalgamation of European, African, and Native American traditions. The indigenous peoples from the Cherokee, the Muskogee Creek, the Choctaw, the Shawnee, and the Yuki tribes are all in the south end of Appalachia. And then the Algonquin and the Iroquois nations in the north also call the Appalachian region home. And the Appalachian Supernatural showcases the richness of the cultural diversity that brings all this together in this part of America. These stories serve as resilient cultural markers, adapting to social societal landscapes while preserving essential elements. The enduring popularity of Appalachian supernatural folklore underscores a broader American ethos of embracing and evolving traditions in response to cultural shifts. And moreover, the deep connection between these supernatural beings and the natural landscape exemplifies an American response to wilderness and enduring conflict between the American people and their environment. So, in my own personal work, I tend to focus explicitly on Northern Appalachian folklore and horror. So that is sort of places that might not spring immediately to your mind when you hear the word Appalachia. So I'm focusing largely, not necessarily in this talk, but in my field of study about West Virginia, Pennsylvania, Eastern New York, and Western New York. Overall, in defining this region, I'm using this map that the American government created in 1965 under President Johnson in their quest to help to mitigate Appalachian poverty. The region of the United States known as Appalachia basically follows this sort of backbone of the Appalachian mountain chain. And these run from Labrador in Canada all the way south to Alabama, which is about 2,100 miles in all. And I said I was going to look up to see what that was in kilometers, and I failed to once again. So you'll have to deal with our ridiculous systems of measurements here. And I'd probably also be remiss if I didn't mention that the Appalachian Mountains and the Scottish Highlands were once part of the same mountain range about 500, rather 50 million years ago, and that much of what we consider today to be Appalachian culture often has its roots in 1600s Scotland. The Stevenson Center for Appalachian Studies at Lees McRae College talks about things like the instrumentation of bluegrass music, the tradition of quilting, and of course distilling that was influenced in this area by the Scottish and then also the Irish and the Scots-Irish. But today, when we talk about Appalachia, we're really talking more about a socioeconomic term than one of simple geography. And I think that's largely because of the way that the Appalachian Mountains help to create the inhabitants and the way that we are. Before highways were built, we were largely cut off from the rest of the world. And out of necessity, we learned to be independent from outsiders. And by the time good roads were built through the Appalachians, and we're thinking here about, really early into the 1960s, we were already entrenched in our age-old customs, traditions, and ways of life in which the supernatural and folklore played and it continues to play a large role in our culture. So to start tonight, well, let me just give you a brief overview. I do want to talk a little bit about theory. Then we're going to provide some older examples of Appalachian folklore, and then we'll look and see how that continues to influence writers today. And I am going to talk a little bit about theory, but I promise not to get too deeply in the weeds. But I do think it's important to talk about the framework that I've been using to study this area and its folkloric products. So with that in mind, I like to focus on the concepts of hauntology, psychogeography, and Mark Fisher's concept of the eerie and the weird. The concept of hauntology in literature, initially coined by the philosopher Jacques Derrida, but further explored by cultural theorists like Mark Fisher, refers to a state of being haunted by the specters of the past. It's a portmanteau that combines the words haunting and ontology, suggesting a condition where the past is not merely gone, but it continues to exert influence on the present and the future. And this concept is especially appropriate, I think, for looking at Appalachian folklore because While America itself is a relatively restless country, I think according to our national census, Americans move an average of 12 times in their lives, but that number is much lower in the Appalachian region. The past here is often more present than the present itself. I was in Jamestown, New York, last year, and this is a small, formerly industrial town on the shore of Lake Erie. I was there for an architectural tour, and our guide started out by apologizing to us for being a newcomer for the area because he had only been there for about 2 decades. In literature, hauntology often manifests itself in themes and narratives and motifs that evoke a sense of nostalgia or longing for a past time. We use it with the Appalachian folklore to explore how the past shapes our understanding of the present and influences our collective memory. This concept of memory is important because hauntology intersects with these concepts of memory, identity, and importantly, the uncanny, because it changes linear notions of time and history, suggesting that the past is not fixed, but is constantly being reinterpreted and reimagined in the present. Hauntology literature may evoke a sense of dislocation or disorientation, blurring the boundaries between past, present, and future. So, Appalachian Ghosts, for instance. In the Foxfire series, which is a collection of Appalachian oral history, folklore is seen really firmly as the past leaking into the present. And in the Foxfire publication, Boogers, Witches, and Haints, Appalachian Ghost Stories, they capture a story that a Mrs. R.L. Elliott relates. And she says, now, up on the mountain, my grandfather killed a man. They was both drunk, and he killed him up on the mountain. They got to fighting some way over a still that was cut down at his place, and he cut his head off and laid it up on a stump, cut it plumb off and laid it up on a stump. And then he served 20 years in prison. But on that mountain, you can pass the stump and you can hear things of the night. Anybody on a rainy night, if they want to hear them, just walk down that road and they can hear them. So overall, hauntology offers a lens through which we can examine themes of loss and memory and the persistence of the past shaping the individual and collective unconsciousness. Is Mrs. Elliott's tale a ghost story, or is it a tale of guilt that seeped through generations? And what is a ghost story writ large if it doesn't connect with our collective unconsciousness? So this part of the theoretical framework then invites readers to reflect on how history continues to haunt and influence our Appalachian lives in the present. So specifically, we can apply this concept to thinking about Appalachian folklore and literature by thinking about industrial legacy, Appalachia, particularly areas on the southern end, like Birmingham, Alabama, and then on the northern end, Pittsburgh, where I am now, has this rich industrial heritage, coal mining, steel production, and manufacturing, but there's also a sense of being haunted by the memory of that now gone economic prosperity and its subsequent decline, grappling with losses of jobs, community identity, and environmental degradation. So in Pittsburgh, we have a number of folk tales about steel workers, and it's important to contextualize this. In 1907 alone, there were 7,000 casualties in the Pittsburgh steel mills. And this is according to Duquesne University's archives. And out of that loss of life and injury, we get folkloric stories that often focus around ghosts. There's Slag Pile Annie. A slag pile is when you're making steel, it's you dump the impurities from the process and it forms into this hard rock sort of thing, and that's a slag pile. And Slag Pile Annie was a ghost that was said to haunt these piles of refuse. And there was also Jim Grabowski, who was a worker who was vaporized when he fell into a vat of molten steel. So if you've never been in a steel mill, who hasn't been in a steel mill? If you've never been in a steel mill, there's a series of catwalks that go above the the vats of molten steel, and it was I don't want to say it was common, but it wasn't unheard of for men to fall from um, these catwalks and end up in the vat, which is what happened to Grabowski. He fell into this vat of molten steel. He was vaporized, and then the folktale came that he came back to haunt the mill. Now, this was a story from the 1920s, but my relatives who worked in the mills were still hearing it in the 1980s. because it's not just a cracking good ghost story, it's also a story from the past that reminded present day workers of the danger of their job. We can look at environmental impact, and narratives can explore how the scars of environmental destruction continue to haunt the landscape, with characters confronting polluted waterways, deforested mountains, and toxic waste sites, especially if we're thinking about places like West Virginia in northern Appalachia. Here, we've had numerous floods of industrial wastewater that have decimated communities. We have this thing called mountaintop removal mining, which is where the entire top of a mountain is taken off to get at the coal rather than digging into it. And this specter of ecological devastation looms large and shapes characters' relationships with their surroundings and their sense of belonging. And we also have cultural heritage. So Appalachia, as I mentioned, is home to diverse cultural traditions, including those of the indigenous people, European immigrants, African Americans, especially during the Great Migration. And hauntology in this facet may involve exploring how these cultural legacies persist in contemporary life, from folk music to storytelling, even to culinary traditions and religious practices. Characters can feel haunted by the weight of ancestral history, grappling with questions of identity, belonging, and cultural behavior. So, overall, applying hauntology to the literature and folklore of Appalachia offers a way to explore the complexities of the region's stories while highlighting how the past continues to shape and haunt its literature in present times. Psychogeography, as applied to literature, is a concept that explores the interaction between the geographic environment and the human psyche and emotions and behavior. It involves the study of how physical spaces and landscapes influence individual experiences, perceptions, and mental states. So, in literature, psychogeography often manifests in the depiction of characters navigating and interacting with their surroundings in ways that reflect their inner thoughts, emotions, and especially journeys. I'll be talking a little bit later on about the contemporary writer Mitch James and his novel Seldom Seen, which really largely deals with this intersection of inner thoughts and the existential journey against this landscape of degradation. So traditionally, the concept of psychogeography has been applied to urban environments, but I think that it's especially appropriate to apply it to the rural and wild environment of Appalachia. So we think about things like sense of place. Psychogeographical literature emphasizes the importance of place and shape in shaping human experiences. The sense, the difference of the Appalachian landscape is a vital part of the folklore. So if you think about the hollers and the bottoms, the isolation that we can have here, and the sheer darkness of the nights removed from the glare of the city, it creates this vivid sense of place that immerses readers in the character's surroundings. And these settings are not merely background scenery, they're actually active participants in these narratives, and they exert influence on the character's thoughts and actions and perceptions. And memory and trauma. Psychogeographical literature frequently delves into themes of memory, nostalgia, and trauma associated with specific location. Characters may revisit significant places from their past. So one thing that I think we're seeing a lot of now in contemporary folktales or updating of folktales is this tradition or this movement that we see with young people who leave Appalachia, go off usually to a bigger city, but then return and have to sort of deal with these memories and emotions that these places and locations trigger. These landscapes then become sites of introspection, could be catharsis and reconciliation as the characters come to terms with their past and then move ahead. And that leads into journeys and quests. Psychogeographical literature frequently features characters embarking on these journeys in sense of meaning, connection, and self-discovery. And it's almost always encountering diverse landscapes, encounters with strangers, and moments of epiphany and revelation. And later on, I'll be talking about the work of Manly Wade Wellman, and I mean that's Wellman's work to a T. This traveling around and acting and reacting with the landscape and people of Appalachia. Um, Overall, then, psychogeographical literature offers us this unique lens through which to explore this relationship between geography and psychology. And it highlights the ways in which physical spaces shape human experiences and this sort of rich amalgam of emotion and memory and narrative that are woven together into these tellings, these tales of the landscape. The concept of psychogeography offers a framework for exploring the literature of Northern Appalachian, and it helps us to provide insight into how the region's landscapes, cultures, and histories shape the psychological experience of the inhabitants that we see in these folk tales. With these vivid descriptions, these complex characters, and these evocative storytelling, they're really bringing forth the rugged beauty of Appalachia to life on the page. Finally, in terms of a theoretical framework, I found the work of Mark Fisher to be especially interesting. I just love this book so much. And it's not explicitly about folktales or explicitly about Appalachia, but in The Weird, the Eerie, Fisher uses this sense of what he calls wrongness as a jumping off point to explore the wide range of all genres, really, is what he attempts to do. He explains his concept of the difference between the eerie and the weird by way of comparing a black hole to a vampire. You might be thinking, what, vampires in Appalachia? But yes, we do have stories about vampires in Appalachia. In fact, Lauren Fowler wrote a really interesting master's thesis called Exploring Regional Identity Through the Southern Vampire, and that does touch on many of the folk tales about Appalachian vampires. But back to Fisher. He suggests that while a vampire might be scary, it's composed of familiar features of the world, but they're organized in a particularly threatening way. And crucially to his definition, there's pre-existing lore that allows us to make sense of these creatures when we encounter them in folktales. I mean, there's rules for being a vampire, right? That relate to the world that we non-vampires, speaking for myself, know and understand, like the power of sunlight. A black hole, Fisher says, on the other hand, is hard to even comprehend. Its effects, the way it distorts the passages of time, are largely incomprehensible to most of us. Black holes don't make sense according to our common sense, and yet we know that black holes and their effects do exist, and then that means that our common sense is what is wrong. We have, in essence, been wrong in how we thought about the way the world works, and this kind of wrongness is encapsulated in Fisher's weird. What the weird and the eerie have in common is a preoccupation with the strange, Fisher writes. And for Fisher, the strange is quite simply a fascinated for the outside, which lies beyond standard perception, cognition, and experience. But the weird and the eerie are different in the way in which they apprehend the strange. Fisher says the weird is constituted by a presence, the presence of something that doesn't belong. There's something out of place about the weird. It's the part that doesn't fit the whole or the part that disrupts the whole, things like interdimensional portals or time loops. So if we think about the works of Lovecraft, for instance, Fisher would place those firmly within the the presence of the weird. The eerie, which is what I think is more appropriate to the study of Appalachian folk tales, is constituted by a failure of absence or a failure of presence. There is something where nothing should be, or there is nothing where there should be something. So we're talking here about disembodied voices, like we're going to talk about in a few minutes regarding the Bell Witch, lapses in memory, people who we know, who when we see them again aren't quite right. The changeling, for instance, that exists somehow within the world in which we find ourselves. So Appalachian folktales then sit squarely within the concept of the eerie. A weird thing is present, but something eerie usually points to something that should be present but is not so. So if you think about a strange clearing in the middle of a dense forest, that would feel more eerie than weird. It also has to do with agency. Something eerie can be felt when something that should have agency doesn't, or something that shouldn't have agency does. So if you think about the very popular haunted doll trope in horror, or more appropriately for our purposes, a hex that has been placed on someone and makes them act in a way in which they normally wouldn't. And the Appalachian series Foxfire captured many of these stories, including a man who had been a great hunter a fantastic marksman. But he came back from the woods one day and found that he could no longer hit the mark. He had been hexed. He had lost the ability to behave in the way in which those around him had become accustomed. And so, as the story is told in Foxfire, the grandfather, the marksman, visited a local witch who took the hex from the man. The witch loaded the gun and went to every corner of the house and shot it, saying, "Hurrah for the devil." The witch then said, "Now the next thing you'll see is a great covey of quail. Now don't you shoot nothing. Then the next thing you see will be a big buck. You can kill him. Just don't shoot anything else." Granddaddy did just as he was told and came back, and here come a big drove of birds. He just held still. He went on, and there was this big old buck. Shot and killed him. The spell was off. So, as tales like this one suggests, the roots of Appalachian horror trace back to folklore and oral traditions where early settlers' fears mingled with indigenous lore. And authors like Manly Wade Wellman laid the groundwork for this genre, embedding local color and psychological depth into their narratives. And this layering of cultural beliefs acts like a palimpsest bubbling up in the form of folk tales. Wellman acts as this sort of secret handshake in many ways for those of us looking into the ways in which modern or contemporary authors use Appalachian folktale. And I've been at several conferences where I stayed to talk to a speaker on the subject, and you can always tell that you've met a kindred soul when you mention Wellman and their eyes light up and they say, "Oh, I didn't know anyone else knew about Wellman." And as a side note, because I love literary gossip, there's a story that is probably not true, but it's too good not to share, that William Faulkner and Wellman were both nominated for the 1946 Ellery Queen Mystery Magazine Award. And Wellman won over Faulkner. And the story goes that then a drunken Faulkner sought Wellman out at the ceremony to pick a fight, only to back down when he saw that Wellman was actually a bit of a mountain man. But Wellman is a pivotal figure in the realm of Appalachian folklore. He does this thing where he weaves these traditional tales and supernatural elements into his narratives. His works, such as John the Balladeer, exemplify the rich oral traditions of the region, blending folklore with themes of magic and the uncanny. And these early Silver John stories are beautifully crafted pieces of work. They have a clear, strong narrative voice, a terrific sense of place, and above all, a cohesive and really original take on mountain culture and homegrown legend. And Wellman spends a lot of time not just sort of relating spooky stories, but really going into detail on the food, the living conditions, and even the folk songs of the region. Wellman lived most of his later life in North Carolina and made a deep scholarly study of the region and its tales in addition to his fiction. And this knowledge really lends conviction and authority to many of his eerie tales about the monster and magic haunted woods of Appalachia. In fact, Wellman's character, John the Balladeer, runs into a seemingly inexhaustible supply of Appalachian cryptids and adventures built on folklore. In his 1946 short story, Sin's Doorway, Wellman takes on the Appalachian, by way of Scotland and Wales tradition, of the Sin Eater, someone who ritually consumes the sins of the deceased so the dead can make their way into heaven. And in this story, John is called upon to act as the sin eater for an Appalachian witch and runs into the dead witch's familiar. And Wellman writes, "It lay prone by the coffin, brown and motionless. At first I thought it was a hound, then I thought it was not. It was hound size and lean like a hound, but its feet were all wrong, big and furry, and its low, close-drawn way of laying on its belly was more like a weasel. Its eyes did not falter as mine met them. I never saw a dog with ears like those, and the face, what I could see between the wide forepaws, was strange. His teeth bared, he crouched low on his rear haunches and lifted his forelimbs. His paws spread their toes like clumsy hands to strike or grasp." So here Wellman is drawing upon just the wide range of folk tales regarding sort of monstrous creatures that haunt the woods of Appalachia, the Wampus Cat, the Pontytail, all of these sort of animals that are not quite right, that don't quite belong, and yet are still found in so many of these folk tales. Another one of my favorites is in the 1980 short story Wellman wrote, Owls Hoot in the Daytime. And in it, he details this strange man who has a giant opossum pet, and they guard an evil portal into the underworld. And I just love it because I can't think of anything more Appalachian than a giant evil possum guarding the gate to hell. Wellman also explores the haunting presence of spirits in stories like The Old Gods Waken, where ancient deities return, reflecting the region's deep-rooted beliefs. And his portrayals of characters like the Balladeer illustrate the complex relationship between humanity and the supernatural, and really showcase how Appalachian folklore serves as a source of inspiration and a lens through which to explore the broader themes of identity and community. Wellman uses this rich tapestry of American culture, and in doing so, he has not only influenced subsequent writers, but he's also helped to popularize our narratives, leaving a lasting impact on the genre of Appalachian folktales. And what we can see from Wellman, and I gotta be honest, I could have spent this whole time talking about Wellman. I just really enjoy the way that he combines these folk tales with the weird and the eerie and psychogeography and hauntology and all of his John the Balladeer stories, which are surprisingly complex and rich for short stories that were written for and published in the disposable genre of the American pulp magazines. If you're looking to read some Wellman, I can strongly recommend the John the Balladeer stories. He also wrote a series of stories featuring the West Virginian judge Keith Hillary Percevant, who fights the Appalachian occult. And these aren't bad; these are decent, but they're not John the Balladeer. And he also wrote a series featuring Professor Nathan Enderby, who battles folklore-based occult forces in rural Pennsylvania, which I do not recommend because even for the time, they are pretty racist. And I would encourage those to be left on the steaming garbage pile of xenophobic American history. But the larger point is that local myths and ghost stories are integral to this genre. The Bell Witch, for example, reflects that community's values and fears. But these narratives aren't merely entertaining, they really echo deeper cultural anxieties and function as cautionary tales. The Bell Witch centers on the 19th century Bell family of Northwest Robertson County, Tennessee. And John Bell Sr. lived there with his family along the Red River. That area is currently, if anybody's from there, it's near the town of Adams, Tennessee. And according to legend, from 1817 to 1821, his local family came under attack by a mostly invisible entity that was able to speak, affect the physical environment, and shapeshift. And some accounts record the spirit also to have been clairvoyant and capable of crossing long distances with superhuman speed, or possibly being able to be in more than one place at a time, which is handy for Appalachia at that time because it would take a very long time to go a very short distance. This haunting began sometime in 1817 when John Bell witnessed the apparition of a strange creature that looked like a dog with the head of a rabbit. And Bell fired at the animal, but it disappeared. John's son, Drew Bell, approached an unknown bird perched on the fence that flew off and was of an extraordinary size. So this probably fits into the folklore of the thunderbird that we sometimes see appearing within these Appalachian stories. The daughter Betsy observed a girl in a green dress swinging from a limb of an oak tree, and Dean, an enslaved person belonging to the Bell family, reported being followed by a large black dog on evenings when he went to visit his wife. Eventually, activity moved to the Bell household. There was knocking along the doors and walls. The family found that something had been gnawing on the bed. They heard invisible dog fights inside their house and chains being dragged along the floor rather. And about this time, John Bell began experiencing paralysis in his mouth. The phenomenon continued to grow in intensity. Sheets were pulled from beds. The entity started pulling hair and scratching children, with particular emphasis on Betsy. And Betsy, I think, is the key to this story, to understanding why it exists. And Betsy was slapped, pinched, and stuck with pins. Referring to the father, John Bell Sr., as Old Jack, the witch said that she was going to kill him. And then the story climaxes with the Bell patriarch being poisoned by the witch. And then afterwards is just a sort of turn the knife a little bit, the entity interrupted the mourners' crying by singing joyful drinking songs. But here's where it gets interesting. In 1821, as a result of the witch's words, Betsy Bell called off her engagement to Joshua Gardner, who, by all accounts, was not a nice guy. And so then we have this sort of folktale that's a wonderful, creepy ghost story, but also, it brings forth this suggestion that young women in Appalachia needed to be careful who they married, or else they might wind up with someone who was actually dangerous. And after Betsy Bell called off her engagement, then the entity told the family that it was going to leave. And it did. And then in 1894, newspaper editor Martin Ingram published his authenticated history of the Bell Witch, and the book is widely regarded as the first full-length record of the legend and a primary source for subsequent treatments. And Ingram wrote, whether it was witchery, such as afflicted people in past centuries and the darker ages, whether some gifted fiend of hellish nature practicing sorcery for selfish enjoyment, or some more modern science akin to that of mesmerism, or some hobgoblin native to the wilds of the country, or a disembodied soul shut out from heaven, or an evil spirit like those Paul drove out of the man into the swine, setting them mad, or a demon let loose from hell. Ingram's covering all his bases here. I am unable to decide, nor has anyone yet divined its nature or cause for appearing, and I trust this description of the monster in all its forms and shapes and of many tongues will lead experts who may come with a wiser generation to a correct conclusion and a satisfactory explanation. Now, today, uh, it's a very popular story. There's been a number of movies made based on the Bell Witch. There's a number of novels that are based on it, and many of us consider Ingram's original 1894 work to really be one of the first explorations of folklore in American literature, and a pretty accurate reflection of Southern Appalachian belief in the region during the 19th century. It's important to remember that folklore is a living, organic thing, and new stories continue to crop up. Some are more traditionally based, like the devil monkey, a creature that I use extensively in my forthcoming novel, Waterbound. And there were several sightings of these creatures in southern West Virginia, one of the more famous in 1994. A woman was driving from an urban area of Ohio through southern West Virginia. She described the area as being very dark and remote. And it was about 2:30 in the morning when suddenly a creature leaped across the road in front of her car. The creature then walked off, seeming not to notice the woman or her car. And she described the creature as a monkey-wolf hybrid. It was covered with short, sleek black fur. It stood on its hind legs at about 6 feet tall and had pointy ears, a flat snout, and a long, thin tail. And she noticed that it was muscular and thin. So here we have this conflict that I mentioned before between the more urban areas of Appalachia and still the more rural areas of Appalachia, and the sort of conflict that occurs when the more urban residents enter the more wild geography and need a story to explain sort of the weirdness that that they feel. Not all recent Appalachian folklore is cryptid based, though. Socioeconomic changes, such as the decline of coal mining, they influence these contemporary themes, and they reflect issues like environmental degradation and the overall loss of community. And these shifts are evident in works like Mitch James' 2022 novel, Seldom Seen, A Miner's Tale, which explores love and loss amidst economic and environmental change. Here, a coal mine serves as both a physical and also a psychological landscape. Coal mining was once a mainstay of the Appalachian economy. There was a large coal mine not 20 miles from where I live, and that is recently closed, and this has been going on for quite some time. And these were extremely high-paying jobs for the region. But they're disappearing rapidly, and they've really proven to be a rich location for folkloric stories. So if we look at this story written in the West Virginia Bluefield Daily Telegraph in 1936, it ran a story about an incident from 30 years prior that occurred in the Pocahontas area of West Virginia. A spirit of a man killed in a mine explosion came to a mine foreman to tell him they had buried the wrong body under his name. The spirit directed the foreman to a spot far from the drift mouth where, by a little digging, you will find my body. Get it out and bury it in a cemetery. So then this story leads us to James's novel almost 100 years later. Seldom Seen is not explicitly horror or folklore, although supernatural events occur, especially in the last two-thirds of the novel. The book is also wound up in depicting isolation, poverty, and methamphetamine manufacturing and addiction. James, a Midwestern transplant to Appalachia, writes in his book, they care for each other, they avoid each other, and they destroy each other, sometimes all at once. And he captures the concept of the eerie in his description of the mind, where a dead miner's forgotten body lies while his spirit travels the area, causing heartbreak or death. So we have this updating of the 1936 Pocahontas tale. Um, James also captures this sort of eeriness perfectly when he writes, the mind's back had a skeletal structure of beams and crossbars and cribs, packed tight with backfill in places and all sealed up with gunite. It was surprisingly silent beneath the earth. The hum of transport, the crunch of residue below the tires, the occasional whoosh of an air course. If not for the forced mechanization, there would be no sound, not like on the surface. Noise is life. But even free of men, the mind wasn't dead, exactly. There was something, a kind of energy present in the long back road, an innate awareness like the womb of a pulse-filled thing. So a central theme in Appalachian folk tales, as seen in James and other examples, is this tension between tradition and modernity. Stories like James and others explore familial bonds within isolated communities, emphasizing how these communal fears can manifest into horror. And this dynamic is crucial to understanding the character's struggle for identity in a rapidly changing world. So as I begin to wrap up, I did want to briefly address the difference, as I see it, between the folklore of the Appalachians and Southern Gothic and the more recent emergence of Rust Belt horror. And so while all these genres can be said to grapple with themes of decay and isolation, Appalachian folklore slash horror often emphasizes the connection to the land and the weight of historical trauma more intensely. At first glance, there seems to be quite a bit of overlap with the Southern Gothic. However, Appalachian folklore is very conservative in its telling, and it rarely dwells upon tropes like forbidden sexuality. There's less of a focus on insanity within the folklore of the Appalachian, and there's not much tension between class and race because the Appalachian region is largely homogeneous, especially when we're looking at the older tales. Finally, and probably most important, although the Southern Gothic may include some supernatural elements, these folk tales that I'm talking about are explicitly supernatural and less concerned with realistic characters and setting. When we're talking about Rust Belt horror, we're talking about a fairly new genre of media that explores the anxieties of the Rust Belt, a region in the United States that has experienced economic decline and deindustrialization. These stories are, well, first of all, they're located in a neighboring but different region, which includes the Midwest and the northeastern United States. And importantly, although the elements of the supernatural are first and foremost in the stories, there's also a focus on characters dealing with the economic despair that, again, is not largely found in the Appalachian folklore, especially older stories. Appalachian stories do reflect the interaction between humans and their environment, but they tend to underscore a recognition of nature's power and mystery, and they embody the complexities of human psychology, our fears, our desires, our quest for meanings. These tales of Appalachia represent the unseen forces that Appalachians have sensed in the forest and mountains that shape our lives, as well as the internal struggles and triumph of the human spirits. From mischievous fairies to our sinister Bell Witch to our werewolf stories, these beings speak to the heart of Appalachian identity. They embody the fears and hopes of a people living in close communion with a land that's both beautiful and daunting. But these stories are more than just entertainment. They're a cultural legacy. They're a way of understanding the world. They're an expression of the human imagination. And I think that as Appalachia continues to evolve, so too will our folk tales, adapting to new circumstances while remaining rooted in this soil. In the end, they reveal a world where the veil between the known and the unknown can sometimes seem thin, and the ghosts of the past are never far from the present. Thank you for your time.